So you've probably all seen the poll on TVNZ tonight. We might throw that at Craig. I'm sure he'll have some things to ask about it. But this first part of the conversation, I wanted to speak to an economist about a common argument that we're seeing in the interwebs, Chewy. So I've asked Craig if he'd come on and talk to us about interest deductibility and government debt for a very specific reason. And I don't know, I'm sure Craig will want to have a crack at the latest breaking news from TVNZ. We want to welcome to the show from the CTU, Craig Renney. Craig, how are you, man?
I'm not too bad. Can you hear me?
I can. If you're on your phone, if you turn that sideways, we'll probably get a lovely full screen from you as well, if you'd like to.
Well, let's try that one.
Oh, look at that. There you go. Just like a paid
wide screen.
Hey, man.
There you go.
How you doing? You all right today? You're not too stressed from too many meetings?
No, it's been a full day, but the only stress has been my laptop deciding that the microphone was the right time for it not to work. So apologies to your viewers this evening because they're viewing this via my iPhone, so they can see it turns my glasses blue on the screen.
Looks perfect. Hey, Craig, now I've emailed you these two questions because I really want to figure this out. On the interwebs, in the social medias, there's been some common conversation, but I faced a bit of it over the weekend, and there was two questions that I wanted to ask. Two questions based around, as I said before, debt, New Zealand's debt, the debt the government has, the debt the country has, and also about interest deductibility. Here's the first question. So I put a tweet out, I don't know, some pithy, intelligent, clever tweet, I'm sure, Chewy, about the government, about, the response to COVID, about where we are right now, about the work that Labor did. And what always happens is someone's come back and goes, yeah, but if we weren't paying $6 billion a year in interest because they wasted so much money, then life would be so much easier. And I went, okay, let's look at that. So I jumped onto, I don't know, some website that talks us about our debt. And I found this. So here's the graph of New Zealand's debt going back to 2007. And my response to that person is that, if you're watching, you can see what I'm doing with my mouse. Down here is when the last, the two Labor ago governments left. And debt was around, let's call that 25 billion. Is that right? The debt?
Yep.
Yeah. 25 billion. Then National came in and it went from 25 billion to up towards 75 billion, give or take. So that's a $50 billion increase in debt under National. Now, also under National and continuing under Labor, it started to trend down and down and down and down and down to 2020, where it was about, I don't know, I'd call that 58 billion. And then COVID hit and it's up to 100 million. So the way I see that is before John Key's National government, our debt was about 25 billion. Then it became 75 billion under National. Then it became 100 billion under Labor. Round figures. And the only point I wanted to make on Twitter, and this is what I want to talk to you about, is yes, it's fair to say that Labor chose to borrow to get through COVID. Yeah. The result from that was more living New Zealanders and more businesses that stayed afloat. So I can see a tangible result for that debt. What I'd like to learn about is what the fuck did we get for the $50 billion that the National government gave us out of that debt? And that's the question I'd like for you to solve for me, please.
Well, we've got a few things. I mean, the first thing in that chart is that it's measured in US dollars rather than in New Zealand dollars. So there's a currency fluctuation that happens in that space. But in terms of the, you're not wrong. Debt did increase very significantly during the last period of the National Party taking office. I'm sad enough to have all of the economic updates of the budget going back to 2007, so I can see all of the net core crown debt. And if I stare at net core crown debt when Labour lost office in 2008, net core crown debt, including the super fund, was zero.
Wow.
Damn.
So that's at the end of Helen Clark's reign, pretty much.
It was minus $2.676 billion. So we actually had a surplus.
So we're in credit rather than being in debt.
We're in credit, yeah. But on a net core crown debt basis or on a gross debt basis, which is the easiest way of comparing these things internationally, we had a debt that was about $31.3 billion in 2008. In 2013, that had more than doubled to $77.9 billion. And then by 2017, that had trebled to $91.5 billion.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So over that period of time, gross debt trebled. Now, the first thing you should always do in economics, whenever you see very large numbers like that, is just discount them. Think about them actually as a percentage of GDP.
Okay.
People's mortgages go up in comparison to 50 years ago, but they earn more. And as a consequence, it's actually about household incomes that are really important in that space. And net core crown debt as a percentage, or gross debt, as a percentage of GDP went up quite a lot. But as a percentage of GDP, it didn't treble over that period. What did it buy? It bought tax cuts. What did it buy? It bought underinvestment. What did it buy? It bought a series of things. Bought lots of roads between places. But did it buy happiness? I'm going to say certainly not. And one of the things that we didn't do during that period of time was invest in the public realm, was solve pay equity, was solve minimum wage, was solve a range of child poverty challenges. Child poverty came down, but it didn't come down anywhere near the rate it should have done. So we weren't getting the value for money for that debt that we did on the other side. Now, during COVID, there are 20,000 New Zealanders who are walking, living, and breathing as a consequence of the government's response.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, I don't want to put a monetary value on 20,000 lives, but debt did go up during that period of time. But we bought essentially life. We bought the economy not falling over. We bought a health service that was able to respond to the challenges put in front of it, one that didn't collapse, as we saw in countries overseas. And as a consequence, that investment will pay off for generations, for decades, because those people will be alive, their children will be alive, they will make investments, they will deliver productivity, they will deliver output. The Crown will make that money back over and over and over again. So what did we get from the National Party during that period of time? Well, we got, to be fair to them, the start and the delivery of our response to the Christchurch earthquake sequence.
Right. Okay, good point, yeah.
And the Crown spent to date about approximately $38 billion on the Christchurch earthquake sequence. We saw a range of other smaller earthquakes, top of the North Island, the Kaikoura quakes, for example, just before the last election in 2017. There was a fiscal response to that. But the argument is not, did the Crown borrow? The Crown did borrow, all governments borrow. The Crown borrowed quite a lot of money during that period of time. For most New Zealanders during that period of time, the value of the public realm and the quality of public services fell. And it fell not because debt was rising. It fell not because we were borrowing money. It fell because we were actually underinvesting. That's how we ended up with mold in hospital walls. You two, I don't know which one of you gentlemen, I think it's Pat, is in Dunedin.
We both are.
Yeah, and I can tell you in the great city that is Dunedin, we're currently rebuilding, the government's currently rebuilding the hospital.
Yep.
And it's going to cost more than $1.5 billion, right? And it's money well spent. What I can't tell you is the cost of lives lost, of productivity lost, of training opportunities lost for not rebuilding the hospital for the 20 years it should have been rebuilt. And we can measure the cost in terms of the debt that wasn't undertaken, but we don't measure the cost on the other side. And unfortunately, the cost is borne on the other side by real people. The cost isn't borne by the government. And so that's why national governments or governments of the right tend to focus on debt reduction, because they're not the ones paying the cost on the other side.
It's interesting because you bring up the earthquake and I'm like, of course. So you've given us a tangible thing to look at. But what you don't hear today, like I literally had someone text me over the weekend or tweet me over the weekend or excrete me, whatever you call an X these days, over the weekend. Yeah, so like a few 91-year-olds got saved for another year and it was lumbered on the shoulders of our children for a generation. It's funny how you don't hear that about the Christchurch earthquake. Yeah, so like, a few 91-year-olds got another flat for a year and it got lumbered on the shoulders of our children. It feels that disinformation doesn't, that feeling around COVID and the paying to it has a very different vibe amongst the community.
Yep, and I mean, in Christchurch, we had the benefit of rebuilding assets that will be there for 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And so there's a positive benefit to Cantabrians and to the rest of New Zealand. We kept families together. Parents, grandparents didn't die. Kids didn't die. I come from a country the UK, which managed this appallingly. And we saw tens, if not hundreds of thousands of excess deaths during that period of time. I know which response I will be proudest of, and it's not the UK one. So in terms of when someone says that's the case, we saved a few grannies, right? Well, okay, I want you to go and tell me what's the value of your grandmother's life?
Yeah. This is the last question. The question is, are you okay with more debt for more alive New Zealanders? You can say no, but you can't have it both ways. You can say, no, I'd rather have the businesses open sooner and more dead people. I'd rather have, the borders shut for a bit longer and have more live. That's the only two options. And for me personally, I'm okay with, so we're facing a bit more debt now than some of the other countries that opened up earlier. Yet the ones that opened up earlier have those terrible death statistics, and we've got better ones. I'm okay with the payoff at the moment. It's going to be a bit harder.
Well, actually, Pat, we're not, because net core current debt in New Zealand, on the internationally comparable measure, is below that of Australia. It's below that of the UK. It's below that of the US. It's below that of most European countries. It's net core current debt on the IMF measure is 5 times the New Zealand rate in Japan. No one is accusing the Japanese economy of not being productive or not delivering outcomes for its people. Public debt and the response to COVID, the debt that we accrued is still leading us nowhere near any kinds of debt ceiling. The Treasury at the budget policy statement this year, so led by the new Minister of Finance, said that our levels of debt were within the bounds of prudence. So even the Treasury doesn't think we have a debt problem in New Zealand. The last time we had a debt issuance in February, it was 700% oversubscribed. So there were 7 times more people wanting our debt than actually the debt that we tried to issue. So we have no debt crisis in New Zealand. The crisis we have in New Zealand is an underinvestment crisis. The debt crisis we have in New Zealand is a public realm crisis. That we have in New Zealand is a productivity crisis. We don't solve any of those problems just by simply arbitrarily cutting our debt.
Don't know about YouTube, but I think I just found a clip for tomorrow to go out. A little short clip there. I like that one. Do you want to jump in with any of these questions about the debt before we move into interest deductibility?
Yeah, you used a lot of words there, but none of them said that Grant Robertson spent all my grandkids' future. So that doesn't help in the election. So we're just going to disregard it. Do you think that National relies on the fact that talking about economics makes a lot of people go cross-eyed, and you can't really put the debt's actually okay on a bumper sticker and win an election? Are they relying on people's lack of knowledge in this field to get wins on the board? Well,
people have a natural aversion to debt, right? Nobody likes paying debt back. People like the things debt delivers, but they don't like then paying it back. I mean, I've got a car outside, and it's great. I'm still paying for it. I hate it, but I like the fact that I have a car. I like the fact there are hospitals. I like the fact there are schools. But people don't like national debt. They think there's something being held over them, and it's a quite natural aversion people have. And when you use very large numbers, when you say debt last year was $89.11 billion, and it's like, well, what on earth does that mean? And so there's quite a natural aversion to wanting to have more debt, even though debt is just a tool. Debt is just an instrument. We have good debt and bad debt. We spent $30-odd billion on a flag $30-odd million on a flag referendum, which is probably borrowed. Is that good debt or bad debt? But if we spend $30-odd million helping families into new housing, they're both a debt, but do we get better outcomes? And that's the thing. We shouldn't be worried about debt. Debt's just a tool. It's just a means to do something. What we should be worried about is actually what we do with it and the kinds of outcomes that we get from that debt.
So if I borrowed 50 grand to put a new roof on my house, that's good debt. That's a good idea.
Well, assuming you need a new roof on your house, yes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted a different color.
Yeah.
No, my roof is leaking, and I borrowed money to get a new roof. That's good debt. If I borrowed the same amount of money and went down to the dairy and spent it on sweets, that would be bad debt.
Good weekend though, bad debt, but a good weekend.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, assuming you weren't cornering the market in lollies in the South Dunedin area, then yeah, that would be bad debt. If, for example, you chose to spend a lot of money keeping people unemployed on benefits, that's probably bad debt. If you spent some money and possibly borrowed some more money and through active labour market programs got people into work, got people trained, lifted people's ability to earn, that's probably good debt. You're actually more in debt, but the economy is better off. Households are better off. And from an economic perspective, their households are more sustainable. Their incomes are more sustainable in the future. Sure, the Crown has marginally more debt, but frankly, that's its job.
Hey, I want to move on to the next question because I remember this conversation on Twitter was going up around landlords, because everyone's saying like, oh, look how good it is when the government cuts its cloth better. It can give $1.7 billion to Farmac. And my response is things like, imagine what they could do if they hadn't given that $3 billion back to landlords. And the response from that is often, yeah, but it's just the government giving back the money that already belongs to the landlords. They're just giving their money back. And I'm too dumb to fully understand it. But interest deductibility implies to me, you'll correct me in a second, because I'll just put my dumb thoughts out there first. Interest deductibility implies to me that the bank gets their money, the landlord pays their money, and then the taxpayer gives money back to the landlord. Sort of, we're the ones that get nothing for it, the taxpayers. It feels a bit like a charity. You know how if I give money to a charity, I give money to a charity, and then the government just gives that money back to me, a portion of it back to me. And I'm trying to figure out. Firstly, is it their money they're just getting back, or is there something that the taxpayer is missing out because we're contributing the money that's going back to them, or is it just less tax coming in income? Yeah, I need dumb explanation for dumb man.
Oh, okay. This is not a straightforward exercise, so forgive me. All tax is money taken from someone. So so when someone says or when someone says I'm not getting the same tax break that I was getting earlier, and they say, but so it's just me getting my money back. No, because you're just not getting the same tax break you were before. That's a tax increase. If I give you back your tax break, that's a tax cut because you're now paying less tax. So in terms of mortgage deductibility, interest deductibility, tax is usually paid on the income received. So an income received is net income. So when you make payments out as a firm, the net income after you've made all of your payments is what you then pay tax on. So if it costs you $100 to make 100 loaves, but you sell them for $200, you've made $100 net income, and you pay tax on the $100, not the $200 of activity that's taken place.
Yeah, the profit.
That profit. Interest is a cost against profit. And so the argument goes, you should be able to write that off as a cost as you would house maintenance, as you would insurance, as you would anything else that costs you in running a business, because you're running a business when you rent a house. The strange thing about housing is that it doesn't obey any of the other rules of running a business. Yeah, if you buy a piece of plant or equipment and you turn the key in the ignition because you just bought it, it devalued instantly. And if you basically traditionally run a piece of equipment into the ground, so you've got a depreciation line for that. Houses go up in value. And when the government is giving you your interest back that you're paying the bank, it's actively helping you create new wealth for yourself and for landlords. And so as a consequence, the Crown ends up contributing to the new net wealth of a landlord. So the landlord is better off as a consequence of the Crown's tax position.
I think it was Anna Burns Francis who said to the Prime Minister on one of her shows, when he was saying things like, well, every other business just gets to pay this much in tax. And she said very quickly, yeah, but every other business also pays tax on their capital gains, whereas a landlord doesn't. So it's not like every other business, is it?
Well, so we don't, no other firm in New Zealand or no other industry in New Zealand pays tax on its capital gains. Because we don't have a capital gains tax in New Zealand, but people do pay tax on the income that they've generated. Workers pay tax on the income they earn from the first dollar of income that they own. Then landlords are the only ones who get to write off the costs, the interest costs of actually helping them to create an asset that gives them additional wealth that's not taxed anywhere. So if they were taxed when they sold the property later on, that would be fine. We could do interest rate deductibility because they've paid tax at some point in the system, just like someone who earns a living has paid tax through their wages. Landlords are the only people who get to write off the costs of earning that living through interest rate deductibility and then pay no tax at the point of sale for their property.
Yeah. So rather than saying other businesses pay on their capital gains, we should be saying other businesses pay on their profits or their income.
Their profit and all of their income. So most systems in New Zealand for tax are what are called EET, exempt, taxed. So you pay money to get materials or goods and services together to deliver a service. You get to write off the taxes at that point. That's exempt. When you sell goods or services, you collect GST, but that's also exempted because it's paid for by the end consumer. Your profits at the end of the day are taxed, EET.
Gotcha.
Property is the only source of income, which is EEE. It's exempted all the way through. And so the only tax that's paid is on the rental payments. And so what mortgage deductibility does is adds a huge tax loss to the rental payments. So the tax lost through those rental payments is then much reduced. The side effect of that is it makes renting a hugely more attractive industry that pushes up house prices because lots of people want to get into that as a much more tax efficient way of saving. And secondly, it reduces the ability of first home buyers to buy a house because landlords can buy a house knowing they can write off their interest costs, whereas a property owner can't.
So that means that if you've got money that you want to invest, the smartest single thing you can do to grow it is to put it into housing, a non-productive asset, rather than investing in a business or somebody's startup idea and that sort of thing, which is why we have this productivity crisis that you're talking about. We're not producing something. We're just selling old houses to each other.
Bernard Hickey famously
the number
said that
always goes up.
Yeah, Bernard Hickey famously said that we have a housing market with an economy tacked on. And we're very good at selling houses and coffees to each other. But after that, we're not very good at all. The rest of our economy is pretty low productivity, be that in, we sell raw logs overseas, we sell milk powder overseas, we sell tourism experiences in New Zealand, and that's pretty much it. We're not very good at actually selling things that have value added, where we add something to a raw product and then sell it overseas as a more desirable commodity. The reason for that is, why would you invest in plant, equipment, technology, R&D, innovation, if you can get far higher returns, tax-free returns, much safer returns in the housing market?
Yeah, and you own a physical brick and mortar building. It's what I always remember people saying about it is like, if the housing market goes up or down, you've still got that physical thing, unlike shares.
Yep, you still or alternatively, if you own, if you're trying to own a patent, or you're trying to own an industrial process, or you're trying to own intellectual property, you get taxed.
Yeah. So back to that original question, when people say, well, it's just them getting their own money back, what's the answer to that then in a nutshell? We just explained.
we say property owners or landlords, sorry, are the only people who benefit from a fully exempt taxation source. They don't pay money. They get their tax back when they pay their mortgage. They get their tax back when they do any other good service to the house, in terms of any repairs, maintenance, depreciation. And when they sell the property, they don't pay tax. Right? Anybody else who runs a firm pays tax on all their profit. They get to write off the costs of interest from any borrowings that they've done. But if they sell a good or a service, they're paying tax at that point in time. A worker, as soon as they cross the threshold of their workplace and earn a living, they're paying tax. They pay tax on the consumption of their goods and services. They don't get to write off their GST. They pay tax on all of their savings. They pay tax on their KiwiSaver. Right? There's a reason why not having a capital gains taxation system in New Zealand causes these disparities. And if we want to do, I would be fully behind reinstalling interest rate deductibility for landlords the millisecond we have a comprehensive capital gains tax that excludes the family home.
There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yep,
Joey, you want to wrap up with anything?
Not really, I guess, directly with this, but I mean, there's other things in our society that are affected by this as well. Like the fact that people can't get into their first home in a timely manner means that they're putting off starting families. That means that there's a big chunk of our population that go into their retirement without their own asset. They're renting until death.
Yeah.
I think we're starting to see those effects now, and it's only going to get worse. Like I think of my own parents are both renting.
And there's a few things in there. So, for example, the welfare state only works because people own their own homes. Because the costs of supporting pensioners and paying their rent is so enormous that the welfare state would need far more money. Two, wealth inequality explodes as you end up with more and more landlords owning more and more property. Because if people don't own their own homes, they don't have the ability to accrue an asset to support them during their retirement. Or to support their kids into homes. And we see huge intergenerational inequality if your parent owns a home and can afford and can be bank of mum and dad to get their kids into property ownership. And then finally, from a straight right-wing perspective, we have fewer small businesses because people have fewer properties to hedge against starting up a firm.
Yeah.
If you want to see a more productive economy, have more homeowners. If you want to see more homeowners, how about a capital gains tax system so that we have fewer people using the system to deliver that sort of advantage?
Craig, there's several super chats that have come while we've been talking, asking you questions. Are you okay to take a few questions from the punters?
Of course.
All right. Junk Rig Sailor, a super chat, thank you for the $10, says, Craig, does a rich country's debt really matter? USA has trillions of debt and they just raise their debt ceiling and borrow more. They are never going to pay it back. Why should we either?
Debt does really matter, but what really matters is confidence in debt. The US can issue trillions of dollars of debt because people have confidence the US will pay it back. And that's how it has the ability to issue so gigantic levels of debt. If New Zealand issued gigantic levels of debt, the question would be, can New Zealand pay that back in the same way? People will always believe the US will pay back its own debt. The level of debt is unimportant. What's important is the confidence of the markets that you will pay it back. And secondly, if you're using the debt for useful purposes, if we're building infrastructure, if we're building housing, if we're doing the things that will deliver us a more productive and sustainable economy in the future, the debt pays itself. The key challenge is that if we issue debt, we're using it for a good purpose. We're not just simply giving it back as a tax cut, which unfortunately looks like what we're likely to do at the next budget.
Yeah. Mr. Arvid says, King Craig, I heard this Prime Minister job might be going soon. You should apply. LOL. It's just more of a comment than anything else. There's
very generous.
couple of comments here rather than questions. You can speak to them if you want, though. Peter says borrowing money isn't a bad thing for a government if it's for capital assets. It amortizes the cost.
Yeah.
Borrowing for tax cuts is nuts, though. I kind of often think about the economy maybe too simplistically, like a personal, like if I just if I borrow money and buy something that's disposable, food or whatever, but if I borrow money to buy the house, then that's the asset sort of thing. I kind of see it as a similar sort of thing. I guess that's what Peter's saying in a much smarter way.
Well, it's not even. There are situations in which you should borrow just to simply push money out of windows. If the economy's tanking, if we have a huge recession, a depression, the job of the government at that point in time is to stimulate demand, is to stimulate growth. So you should borrow and just simply pay people to dig holes and fill them, to quote Keynes. Because what you're doing is you're inducing demand in the economy. There are times when you should pull money actively out of the economy. If the economy is going gangbusters, the economy is red hot, you shouldn't borrow to actually then spend more money, because you'll be acting pro-cyclically. Most people think about government spending like their own household. If they're in debt, it's bad. If they've got lots of money, that's good, right? Think of the opposite. When the economy is doing really well, that's when the government should withdraw and not add to stimulus. When the economy is not doing really well, like now, that's when the government should be adding and should be stimulating and helping people into work.
That's the other thing that I was mentioning with someone over the weekend. It's like, in my adult brain, if you're going through sort of austerity measures and cutbacks, you would therefore hope and want and expect that at the end of this term, because of those cutbacks and because of the government saving money, we would see a big reduction in that debt. Like, we would hope they'll have paid some down, but if they're just borrowing to get like a net zero so they can give tax cuts, then we're going to get to the end of this term and it's going to be no better, if not worse, even though it's been a much more austere time we've been living in.
Oh, well, certainly. And that's been the experience in the UK. Is that, when the Conservative Party took over in 2010, huge austerity program, delivered quite savage cuts to many public service departments and many bits of local government. Did the UK improve? No, of course it didn't. But is the UK economy better off than it was in 2010? No. It's just simply, we cut our cloth, we reduced spending and hoped that things would get better. This is why a lettuce lasted longer than a prime minister in the UK. But that sort of magical thinking, that simply, if we just cut our cloth, if we just simply reduce our spending, if we just simply manage what we're doing better, if we just have a bit less ambitious for the country, then we'll be okay. We have to recognize that as an economy, there are things that we need to do. There's economic development that needs to occur. There's jobs that need to occur. Otherwise, we're just simply buying a smaller economy and less growth in the future. And that's what an austerity agenda does.
Hey, Chewy, we've got to let Craig go. I'm going to give him one more super chat before we head off. But is there anything you want to wrap up with as well, Chewy? I'm going to cut it short for you. So.
I just want to say there's clear historic examples of what you're talking about, of like when times are bad, you spend the money. Germany building its Autobahn system in the 30s, the massive projects post stock market collapse that they had in the US, massive work programs just to get people working. They built dams and highways, and even here in New Zealand in the 80s, the Think Big projects were basically that idea as well, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and there are plenty of examples, all around the world of essentially of government-led economic development, where it says we're going to do some things. There probably isn't the demand for these goods and services right now, but by the end of that period, we will have got ahead of the investment curve, and we'll be a better economy. We'll be a more productive economy as a consequence. Some of the best investments aren't actually physical. They're investments in education. They're investments in skills. They're investments in health, because they have multi-generational payoffs. And as a consequence, this is not just simply about investing in bricks and mortar. This is investing in people and making sure that actually they have the ability to thrive in the future and have some income and economic security in the future. Because when we have that, we don't have we don't have populist governments in countries that are secure. We have populist governments in countries where the population is economically and income insecure.
We'll let you go, Craig. We've had you for too long. We thank you for your time, though. I just wanted to say Spider-Hoof says, hi, Craig, love your knowledge bomb with an excellent mahi on how fiscally inept this government is. Speaking of this government, we won't hold you for this, Craig. We'll go and do it in a second, though. I mean, there was a poll out today.
Yep.
One News poll. Obviously, the poll means nothing when it comes to electing a government. I think what it does do, though, is it does comment on the feel of the nation as to how it's a referendum on how the government's doing and how ACT are doing and how New Zealand First is doing primarily above everything else. Do you want to add anything to what we saw on One News tonight?
Just one thing. It's sort of a note of caution and a note of optimism. I've worked for oppositions when we've been at terrible lows for the Labour Party, and I've worked for governments when we've been at stratospheric highs. Polls are polls,
yeah.
But what it does do is it does suggest that the public has bought change, but it's not necessarily sure it likes the change that's happened, and it's not necessarily sure it likes how that change is being delivered. We have approximately 950 days until the next election. We have to spend every single day telling the public, telling New Zealanders there's a better way of doing this than the way that this government is doing what it's doing right now. And if we don't, we'll have missed our opportunity, because if we get them out after one term, we can undo the damage they're doing right now. If we get them out after 3 terms, that's a much harder job.
Oh, both inspiring and terrifying what you just said at the end there, Craig. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm always grateful when you jump in, and we'll talk again super soon. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks, gents.
Kia ora again, whānau. The clip you've just watched is brought to you today by our patrons. If you want to be a part of what we do, if you want to get behind what we're doing, if you're enjoying our content and wanting to share our content, then maybe you would consider being a patron to Big Hairy News. Head to www.patreon.com/Big Hairy News to sign up to one of our levels and be a patron. At this point, we are only a listener and viewer supported show. It all comes down to you guys. If you feel like jumping on board to help, then head to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Hooroo.